Welcome to the Objective Recovery podcast, where we talk about mental health very open-mindedly. One aspect of pretty much every mental health challenge is how our own minds and identities can keep us running unproductive circles, sometimes leading to great suffering and loss of potential. Today's guest is Alanna Levenson, a coach high-performing leaders and entrepreneurs turn to when success starts to feel like a slow suffocation. So welcome, Alanna. Please share with us a bit about how you got interested in this type of work.
Oh, Henrietta, thanks for that introduction. Gosh, it's been a long journey. Yeah, I've been doing this for 20 years, and when I first got started, it was one of those stories where I was in a conversation with a friend of mine who I had known since seventh grade. And here we are, adults, years later, and we're just catching up. And she says, you should do this for a living. And I thought, do what? Like, what am I doing? And she said, have you ever heard of coaching? And this was 20 years ago. And I said, no. And so, there wasn't that much information on the internet at the time, but I started researching it and I got cheap Vistaprint cards made and I got curious and I started noticing that people just would gravitate towards me, or I'd be sitting next to somebody on an airplane and they would just start opening up to me about things. And so I thought, I'm just going to start giving my card out and see what happens. And I started to get clients that way. And in the beginning, because I was dipping my toe in the water, I worked with some people pro bono, complimentary. Some I charged, but very little. And one of the things that I've very much reflected on, because I've also had to, in owning my journey of doing this work, is looking back, well, how did this happen? And how did I recognize that this is actually potentially my purpose? And it goes back further than that. When I was in junior high, high school, people would come to me and they would tell me something or share something with me or ask for help in a way they wouldn't ask their best friend. They would say, "Hey, I'm pregnant," or "I have an addiction and I want to, I'm drinking too much," or they were on drugs and they wanted to stop doing it, or they confided in me about a parent was molesting them and they entrusted me with this really personal, private, deep, intense information that they wouldn't trust anybody else, which, looking back at a young age like that, maybe that was a lot for someone like myself to handle, but yet that's what happened. So,
It's very interesting because I heard similar stories from other people, and at one point we even had a research study, and we tried to identify what personality characteristics correlate with this type of trust, that what you
right.
described. So, have you figured it out yourself why people tend to trust you with their personal stories and why they feel compelled to speak with you?
The feedback that I've been given that also very much translates into the work that I do today is people have told me that they feel safe with me, that they trust me. They know that I'm not gonna that I'm gonna maintain confidentiality in essence. I mean, when you're a teenager, you don't use that language, but that they knew I wouldn't tell anybody else. They knew that I would, not knowing how to communicate in this language back then, but be in essence objective in how I supported them or told them what to do. It was what was best for them, not what was best for me. And sometimes people have told me that although they may not have been ready for what I told them or shared with them, that they reflected on it and they would come back and say, it's not what I wanted to hear, but it was what I needed to hear. And that for whatever reason, what I said helped kick them into some sort of action that they weren't doing or to resolve something in some way that they hadn't thought of.
Does it ever feel overwhelming to you when this becomes too much? I tell you an example that I very often hear, for example, from psychotherapists, which is different. Usually they go a bit deeper, into really personal, complex things than a coach would do. And many describe reaching burnout at some point, even quitting the profession, because it's emotionally they find it hard to handle. And one very important factor is to be able to basically develop certain type of shield, protect yourself, a good balance between being approachable and, someone sensitive enough so that people trust you, but also at the same time protective of your own self.
Well, let me back up a second and say that when coaching did come into my realm, when no one hardly even knew that it existed, I was afraid. The thought process and the feeling that I went through was, oh my gosh, I'm going to be responsible for somebody else's well-being.
Mm.
And I did go through, even though I dipped my toe in the water and I did it, I started doing coaching in essence since 2005. I did get certified, my first certification in 2008. And that started to teach me some tools on how to not take on and own somebody else's journey, somebody else's process, somebody else's emotions and feelings onto myself and let them be with them. And then to take it even further, over the years of as I've learned more and more tools around meditation or heart math techniques or mindfulness practices to be more intentional and purposeful in that way. Not only, the practices during a session while I'm working with someone, so I can keep their stuff in essence over there and my stuff over here. It was in between sessions as well, and making sure that in scheduling, which I also help other people with their calendars as well, because that seems to be a real issue for people in terms of calendaring and scheduling and prioritizing and that sort of thing, and getting overwhelmed or burning out even from just that. As a practice, I had to learn to create time buffers in between my conversation. So I'm not pulling in something that had just occurred from a previous session into my next conversation, so that I can truly start from a place of a blank slate for whoever I'm about to work with next. So now I actually have tools and techniques that I use to practice with intention to do that, to clear the way, so that I'm fully present with whoever I'm about to work with next.
I even experience, to some extent, similar simply communication and meetings. I think anyone can benefit from self-care methods. You shared with me previously that one area you work on with clients is reframing.
That was new clarity, new language that I've realized, is that in essence, I'm a reframer. It can correlate to pretty much any context, really. But in essence, what it means is I help you think about something in a new light. You see it through a new lens or a new perspective, with additional insight. And with that, you'll do something with that differently than maybe you would have before. Let's say it's an entrepreneur who hires people, and they might have a belief system, because it can correlate with belief systems too. It's hard to find good people. Okay, well, let's take a look at where that's coming from. And it could be either because they're observing other people having a hard time with employees, or they themselves have had a hard time. So where did it come from? And then what's a different way of looking at it? Because there's a lot of people out there. And once somebody can really pivot and reposition the way that they're showing up, that they can pivot the way that they are, say, posting an ad or describing the job description or interviewing someone in the interview process. Or let's say they hire somebody, and then how do you onboard them or how do you train them? All of those are important steps in that process that correlate with that one belief system, which is it's hard to find good people. Because what'll happen is if you believe it is hard to find good people, then any part of that process will get off track. It'll get derailed, or you'll approach it in a way well you're going to actually sabotage it yourself, unknowingly.
So what is the next step to that? Would you encourage them to explore why they think that it's hard to find good people? Because that's how I would, intuitively think about it, and to look for reasons, to look for the roots in myself. So why I even have this perception, this idea? Is it anything like that? Or?
Absolutely. And it's different for different people. So for one person, it might be once we start talking about it and we start peeling away some layers and we get into the deeper conversation around it, they might realize, well, gosh, maybe it's not really about them. Maybe it's about the fact that I am not comfortable being a manager, that I've been given feedback that because I hold such a high standard, that I'm so detail oriented, that people feel intimidated and they feel less than, and they don't feel that they can perform or do things up to par, and then so they think I'm going to judge them, and then they don't show up naturally as themselves and they hold themselves back, they don't take initiative, and so there's so many, it can be very simple but yet very complex at the same time. So yeah, exploring where it's coming from, how it shows up for them, what experience they've had with it, what their contribution was to it, what somebody else's contribution was to it, without blame, without judgment. It's just feedback and gives you information. And then you'll start to see, okay, this is where we can tweak this. This is where maybe you can start to do this differently.
And do you ever give them actually feedback what might be the explanation, or you encourage them to find their own truth, like we said in your introduction, that you walk besides them? Because I always hear one thing I always hear from coaches is exactly what I just mentioned, is that coaches always say they don't offer a solution. They are just there and try to guide people to find their solution.
Yeah, very much. I mean, there's a distinction between a consultant and a coach. A consultant will very much offer solutions, whereas traditional coaching does not. It's about, very much asking open-ended questions and discovery and helping the client figure it out for themselves. I'm not going to say that I don't ever tip over into giving advice or in that consultant mode of making suggestions. Sometimes I do, because something that I've also found in doing this work and working with senior leaders in corporations and working with business owners is they're moving very fast and they don't have a lot of time. And so sometimes they want advice. Sometimes they want, for me to make some suggestions. Although I always position it, again, reframe and positioning. I'm always positioning as, here's a suggestion. And then I'll ask, how do you resonate with that? What are your thoughts about that? Can you see yourself implementing that? If you were to do that, how would you do it? If I was to give them a way of communicating something, because I also do consider myself a communication expert. And so I help people in that realm too. So I'll offer them, I use it as an offering. I'll offer them a way of communicating something. And then I'll ask, how would you say that in your own language? And I'll say, and I give you permission to use mine if it resonates with you and you can see yourself using it.
Do you ever find that people have resistance to this exploration, that basically for example, that someone would not be willing to explore what's causing these hesitations in themselves, and they still keep trying to look for the solution out there in the environment, in other people?
That's a great question too. Happily and luckily, resistance doesn't show up too often, because most people that I've worked with or have had the pleasure of working with, when they get to this point with me in the process, they're pretty ready to make changes. They know things need to be changed. They know that there's things that they can work on, and they want. Every once in a while, like a new client got triggered by the word challenge. I said I'd love to help you with certain challenges. And what was interesting, I reflect on all of it too, because I recognize my contribution to the conversation. I recognize my contribution to how something lands with someone. And so he came back, and I think he thought that I was saying that he's challenged in some way. And so I clarified that that's not what I meant at all, and then expressed my intention. And then he continued to stew about it. Um, and so he sent me a voice memo, and I sent him one back, and I owned what I said and apologized again for it landing that way. And I gave him a choice to kind of go back and do some steps that maybe we didn't cover, because I was sensing that there was a little bit more rapport and trust that needed to be developed between he and I, to understand more about how I coach, what my intentions are, that you are totally at choice in what you do. Like, yes, I have a framework. Yes, I have tools. Yes, I'm going to offer those things. Yes, I have ideas about how we are going to spend a session together. That said, I will often at the beginning of a session say, how can I provide value to you today? Because sometimes it's not about my agenda. Oftentimes there's something that they know they want to specifically work on, or something happened and they want to talk it out loud. And so I want to coach on that, because that's like right there, right? And then that gives them something really tangible and valuable to go immediately implement into their life, versus me saying, well, let's put that on hold for now because I want to go over here and do this with you.
It's just so interesting because it shows just how subjective everything is and how important it is to personalize, to understand first, at least to a certain extent, every single unique situation. So the challenge is very funny because actually for me, again, subjectivity, for me, that challenge is one of my favorite words. So I very often use challenge instead of problem or issue, this kind of things, because in my mind, challenge is a more like a milder word, but it's so interesting. That's the first time that I ever hear from anyone that, it may not be welcome. I even use that word very often in my social media posts and so on. So
Yeah.
it's very interesting to actually think this, it's just a double check sometimes that who the audience is and how this will go over with that particular
Yeah.
situation. Especially because, I work a lot with people who have actual mental health challenges or issues or problems, whatever we want to call them. And, those people usually start with a very sensitive, like default state, baseline.
Yeah.
And I think those people are a bit more open to, vulnerable and dig a bit deeper compared to like a business executive who is there in coaching to, basically just construct a business strategy and so on. And then in that situation, it's especially important to choose the right language word. And so in the addiction field where I operate, it's a huge separate discussion that, what's the correct language. And there are so many debates about this. So it's interesting.
Yeah. And on the topic of language, I'm a geek about that. To me, it's really important, the language that is used. Speaking of language, what's really interesting is, like, lately I've been finding out that our species, we didn't start out with verbal language. We were more telepathic. And then language got created, and that's how we primarily, use to communicate with one another. And oh my gosh, there's the potential for misperceptions and miscommunication all the time. And the use of a word can mean one thing to one person and something to somebody else. And so, in this example that I just shared with you, in sharing with him that, I'm owning what I said, and I apologized for the way that it landed, and reclarified my intention, and said, where would you like to go from here? What was interesting is this person left me a voice message back and said, you know what, I've done some self-reflection on this, and actually you don't owe me an apology, I owe you one. And he realized that he was feeling in this need to control mode. And I see that a lot showing up, and it shows up in different ways for different people. But we're in this world where there's often uncertainty, and in our internal world, in our immediate physical world, in the larger physical world, that can cause unsettling doubts, insecurity. And so it's our need to create certainty for ourselves. We end up finding ways to see what we can control in our lives. And then that ends up happening like literally within a conversation and we don't even realize it.
Yeah, uncertainty is one thing that people are especially sensitive to, because it's like a wiring, biological, evolutionary wiring. The uncertain outcomes, whatever field, whatever it is, whether it's business or personal life, anything that's usually anxiety provoking, and so it's one way that also when I work with people, that's one area that we tend to focus on, to make people realize that how important it is to become more comfortable with uncertainty. So anxiety is all about uncertainty, perceived uncertainties. Very often it's actually not even out there. There is all this talk these days, the past few years, that the uncertainty in the world, starting with COVID and the economy and all the conflicts and the divisions and politics and all that. The AI, people are very, very afraid of that also these days, many people. And it creates a very high level of uncertainty. So I think it's very timely too. It's one area very timely to work on. So in terms of the reframing, is there any area where you feel it's not always constructive to encourage someone to reframe, to change their beliefs? Because it can induce, for example, overthinking, or it can generate like false tracks, distractions, and so on.
That's a really great question. And although in the end, I do think it's something valuable almost all the time, sometimes people approach that too quickly. They're not ready to reframe it. And so if they're constantly looking to that as the immediate solution, they might be skipping some steps where they can gain some self-awareness, get some insight, realize some things that will then help them with the reframe, and that when they do the reframe, that it actually sticks versus defaulting back to where they were before. So if somebody resorts to just the constant, like immediate, okay, I got to reframe this for myself, I have to reframe this for myself, then that becomes an unproductive way of resolving things for themselves. And then, like you said, it can actually cause more stress and anxiety. And then ultimately, because there's things underneath that they didn't work on that they probably needed to, it doesn't stick.
Another version of this that I actually very often come across is all of us have certain insecurities, self-esteem issues, deep down at least, and
Yeah.
they can generate a lot of, difficulties. There is so much talk these days about, for example, self-love, self-acceptance. We need to be more gentle with ourselves and so on. But I often find these days that sometimes it gets a bit too extreme. Sometimes those ideas encourage people to accept not acting, not doing, not taking care of things, not progressing, not doing anything. So basically just accepting. I wouldn't want to use the word laziness, but basically not accomplishing, not working toward our goals, justifying with this idea that I'm just trying to be more gentle with myself. I'm just accepting myself. I'm accepting my limitations. So what do you think about this? Because I feel this is very, very common. I had to really figure this out for myself. I found that it was actually quite deep. So I really had to do a bit of soul searching.
I love it. So, what this has to do with, you didn't say the word, but to me, this has to do with self awareness.
Mhm.
So I have a distinction I came up with a long time ago because here's what I realized. So, coaching in general, if you were to sum it up in one word, it's an industry of self awareness. And then everything else spins out from that. So, if I was to go up to every adult on the planet and ask, do you think that you're self aware? I would suspect that a very high percentage of people would say, "Oh yeah, I'm
Yeah,
self-aware."
everyone,
Yeah,
every adult.
almost everybody would be like, "Oh yeah, I'm totally self-aware," right? But then why do we have the dysfunctional sometimes world that we have in the way that we have it, or why do people want to get better at communicating? Because there's issues, right? There's challenges with it, and there's such a lack of understanding. So I created this distinction a long time ago between somebody who's self-aware and somebody who's profoundly self-aware. It's very subtle, but it's powerful. And when I teach this to people, they remember it. And then they get to be at choice with whom they want to be, who they prefer to be. And it usually kicks them or inspires them to take action to practice things differently. And here's the distinction. So the self-aware person will say, oh, yeah, totally. That's how I am. Yep. I know that. Uh-huh. And to your point, they don't do anything differently. They just, oh, there's that level of, it's sort of that level of self-acceptance. Like, I'm just going to accept that this is who I am. And what they're not saying, the undertone of that is, and you have to deal with it. It is what it is, right? That kind of attitude. So the profoundly self-aware person says, yeah, I know. That's who I am, and that's what I do. And I'm realizing it doesn't serve me anymore. It's having an impact on other people, and I want to make a change. And in the beginning, it's reflecting back on what's already occurred and kind of going, there, I did it again. And that's not how I wanted to show up. That's not how I wanted that situation to end up. That's not, how I want it to be. And so in the beginning, it's a self-reflection. And then because their level of awareness starts increasing, they start to catch themselves in the midst of the moment. And they might go, hey, wait, time out. Give me a moment. This is not how I wanted this to go. Or this is not the direction I want this conversation to go in. Or maybe they said something and they said, so, you know what? I'm sorry. That's not what I meant. And they start catching themselves in the moment. And they keep practicing it and keep practicing it and getting better and getting better and getting better. It's not about getting it right. It's not about getting it perfect. It's just a practice. And the more you practice it, the easier it gets. And then before you know it, they start to go, wow, they'll catch themselves ahead of it, that they're about to say something and then they won't. They'll sit back and bite their tongue and just listen. And then they start to listen in a whole new way. And then they get so good at practicing it that they'll see it coming and be like, oh, there's that trap again. I'm not going there, right? And then they start realizing, oh gosh, that thing that I used to do, I'm not really doing it anymore, right? Now, I'm not saying that people are perfect and that they don't ever default back to that old way of being. Sometimes they do, and it's just they can go through that process again, but it's faster. But that's the profoundly self-aware person, is they know they do it. They see the impact on themselves and others. They want to do it differently. They practice doing it differently. And by doing that, they see the results of it. And it actually starts to transform not only their experience, but the experience with others. And sometimes that starts to transform relationships, how work gets done. And it's really beautiful to watch.
And do you think that self-awareness, this profound self-awareness, actually generates action? Because I often find that, including from my own experience, this was my biggest struggle actually in life, that self-awareness, as being self-analytical and even honest and, just dissecting everything. I can do this forever. And, I was, for example, in psychotherapy and coaching as well. But it's a very different world to actually make it happen. And
Yeah.
so with the methods that you use, do you feel that people are actually more motivated once they become profoundly self-aware, as you described? They are also more motivated, because I find these are two things.
I love that question. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes they're like, oh gosh, okay, now what do I do? I also have to sometimes remind people not to beat themselves up about who they've been and how sometimes they can show up, right? So this is not about doing this with judgment of yourself, judgment with others. Sometimes we'll role play if there's a particular situation or with the person that where it's showing up, I'll say, let's role play. I'm going to be you, you be that person, and I'll model to you a way on how to do this differently. And then we'll reverse the role and say, okay, now you be you, I'll be the other person. And then it gets it into their cellular memory, or, in their file cabinet or their tape recorder, if you will, in their brain science. So now they can tap into that because they've already practiced it in real time. And then sometimes it's talking about different strategies that they might use to do it differently in a particular way. And then I'll ask the question, can you see yourself doing that? Right. So in essence, they're like, you know what? Yeah, it's like, am I saying yes to this? Am I committing to this? And then it's like, okay, when and how or where, with whom are you going to do this with? And then also helping them see forward. If you were to do it this way, what different kinds of outcomes do you think you'll experience? What different kinds of outcomes do you think the other person or other people will start to experience because you're now doing this differently? So it gets them to envision what it could look like and what other types of outcomes could be, whereas before they didn't have that.
Can you give maybe one or two examples of that when people very clearly really benefited and it changed really something very visibly in their process, their business, their life, anything?
One example that comes to mind is with a current client. I've been working with her now for almost a year on herself, her leadership, and her business. And she actually, in the very first few sessions, again, catching on to language, I would hear her call herself a control freak. And so I got curious. I was like, oh, this is interesting that this is showing up a couple of times now. So at some point I said, do you mind if I reflect back to you something that I've now heard you say a few times? And she said, sure. And I said, I've heard you call yourself a control freak. Where's that coming from? She was like, oh, she had never thought about it before. And she realized that at some point in her life, somebody called her that when she was younger in kind of a teasing way. And then and it was somebody in her family. And then other people in her family caught on to it. So now everybody else started her calling that. So then she started calling herself that. And then I started asking her, like, how do you feel when you hear it or when you call yourself that? Well, actually, although she would say it in jest, like joking, other people would say it in jest and in joking. She's like, actually, it doesn't feel so good. Where do you think it's coming? Like, what do you think people are observing in you that maybe makes them see you that way in comparison to how maybe they may be different? And she's, so that she then started thinking about it deeper. And she's, well, I tend to be more direct and more purposeful and more self-disciplined and really structured compared to other people. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. And I said, so what impact do you think this is having on you and your business? And it then correlated with her fear around hiring someone to support her on her team, which, by the way, as a small business owner, and she's got a very successful business. She's in the beauty manufacturing business. First, she was a distributor. Now she's a manufacturer. And her husband do the business together, and they've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars, but they were trying to do it all by themselves. And they were at a point where they used to have staff, but they let everybody go because it didn't work out. And she didn't have anybody working for her for like 10 years. Well, to speed up, what's happened, she now has 2 new team members, and she's about to hire a third, and it's going really, really well. And what's really cool is not only did we get her to a place where she stopped calling herself a control freak, I coached her on how to support others and not calling her that anymore. So no one else in her life calls her a control freak. And now she's also talking about that need to control. She's letting go of doing things the way that she used to, which has now enabled her to hire and be a good manager and leader and being able to delegate and have other people do things that she felt she had to do because, well, I can't hire anybody else to do it the way that I'm going to do it and the way that how fast I'm going to do it, right? Like, so it's that kind of thing. It's very nuanced.
That's wonderful, and it's also funny once again for me because I sometimes used to do that, call myself a control freak.
Okay.
Usually, I didn't go as far, so I wouldn't call myself that, in front of others, but just even not even seriously. But it's exactly what you said that for me, it's actually for me calling myself that in my own head was part of a process to actually make myself more disciplined, because when I was younger, I struggled with that. And I had, other tendencies in other areas of life that I really wanted to control, but not everything. So, for example, in work, some areas that I didn't control properly. So it was very imbalanced. So I used this. I remember myself, it was a few years ago. I remember myself, I consciously I worked through this, just basically shifting that control, where should I be a control freak? But I didn't share it with anyone else. It was just for my own mental process. So it's very, very funny. Finally, the last question I would like to ask is that what we have discussed so far, it's all about when someone, they start with a certain stage when they want to improve something. But do you think that this type of reframing can be used in a preventative way as well? That let's say someone learns, the control freak example or anything, and then they will automatically learn to develop a habit to check in with themselves in the future, even without you as a coach, and then it's no longer an issue with them because it becomes an automatic behavior or thought process. Do you see this?
Yeah, all the time. And the funny thing is I will sometimes hear clients say, I was in this situation and all of a sudden I heard your voice in my head. I was like, you
Yeah.
were saying, no, but they're like, oh gosh, okay, this reminds me of the conversation I had with Alanna where we were talking about this, and okay, this is that opportunity to do things differently. So, that's the practice of it, right? It's like the I only get to work with people once a week or once every other week type of thing for an hour or so. And the rest of it, they're on their own. So, it's like it's taking what we're talking about, taking what you've learned, what you've discovered, what you've reaffirmed for yourself, giving you tools and techniques. And then the rest is up to you to put those things into practice. So when people really start to do that, they're empowering themselves. And then, yes, they start to see how, oh, this can be impactful in this situation. And then they start to look for opportunities to use them even more. One example is, so I've been a geek about brain science for a long time, and now I'm a geek about heart science. And I got certified via heart math. And there is a lot of really cool science around the heart. We've been, in essence, lied to about what this is. It's not a pump, it's a vortex, and it's frequency based. And I'm learning more and more about frequency and the power of it because we are frequency beings. We are electrical beings. It's how our brain works. You know that, right? So when we can practice things with intention, so I have various techniques that I teach people you can do in 30 seconds, a minute. And there was this one director at a construction company, it's a construction industry company, let's just say. And he loved doing this technique. And this one time he said, Alanna, I just have to tell you, you forgot to do this with me at the beginning of our last session. I said, I am so sorry. And I said, hey, wait a second. I sent you the handout for it. You can do this on your own without me. And he started laughing and he turned around and he showed me that he had printed it out. And I was like, see, you can do that on your own. You don't have to wait for me. And he said, okay, I'm going to start doing that. The next session, he said, Alanna, I started practicing it on my own. And this is somebody, by the way, who's been working at this particular company for over 20 years. And he has direct access to the CEO. And he shared with me that he did it before going into a meeting with the CEO. And he said, for the first time in 20 years, that CEO said to me, you're doing a great job. Now, did it have anything to do with the technique? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But he showed up differently. He felt it. And then, that showed up and he was just in total gratitude for it. So, you just kind of never know. And it's just really somebody being willing to put things into practice. And then once they do, they start to see the evidence themselves of the impact that it has. I can't do that for them. All I can do is teach it to them, share it with them, offer it, and then it's up to them.
What's so wonderful about this process is that sometimes we can impact people in so many different ways that we will never see, because I guess coaching is a limited period of time, and we never actually learn the full picture in how many different ways they can implement this lesson. So how long is usually the coaching process? Is there any average?
Right now, I offer 6-month or 12-month engagements. That said, sometimes people renew. I also have a client who I've worked with on and off for about 14 years. So it's just the way I look at it is, I mean, yes, I have longer engagements now because I see the benefit and value of that, to be in a journey and, in essence, walk beside you during that period of time. And then at the end, I work in a celebration and integration session. And during that conversation, you'll either say, you know what, I got what I needed and thank you. Or they'll say, you know what, I think I want to keep going and continue on. And they don't necessarily use these words, but it's like there's more expansion, there's more growth, there's more. Sometimes it's I want to now continue with whatever's happening in my business or in my career, whatever it is, right? It's different for everybody, and I check in along the way. But yeah, so it just kind of depends.
Thank you, Alanna, very much. Hopefully this clarified some things about coaching, because I find that many people find it very bit mysterious, including myself. Before I first experienced, it's just, therapy, counseling. People are a bit more, they have ideas, but that might involve coaching a bit less. So last question is, how can people find you if they want to experience this process?
Thank you. Yes. I'm kind of everywhere. So I have a website. It's ilovemylife.com with dashes in between. So I-love-my-life.com. I'm on LinkedIn, restarted an Instagram account. I'm on Facebook. I'm not on Twitter too much, but I do have an account there. So, but yeah, my website, LinkedIn are two primary places I am besides, say, Facebook. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. We will put all these in the description for the viewers.
One thing really quickly too, if you go to my website, you can sign up for my newsletter. And I don't spam you every day. I send out a newsletter once a week. That said, you'll also get a free download on procrastination. So if anybody struggles with that, I talk a little bit about the myths around it, and again, some reframes for you to move you into action. So that's something that you'll get when you sign up for my newsletter. So thank you.
I'm sure that will be useful for pretty much everyone, because I don't think that there is anyone who never had issues with procrastination. Thank you again.